Winifred Holloway had a reputation in the town of Cedar Hollow, Ohio, for being the person everyone called when their lives fell apart. She was 34 years old, worked as a family therapist out of a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, and by all outward measures, she had built a life devoted to helping others heal. What? Almost nobody knew. Her clients, not her friends, not even her own mother, was that Winifred hadn't taken a single day off in 6 years, hadn't been on a date since her divorce, and hadn't cried in front of another human being since the funeral of her father 4 years earlier, where she had spent the entire reception comforting other grieving relatives instead of grieving herself. She was, by every professional standard, remarkable at her job. She had helped the Delgado family repair a relationship between a father and his estranged son, sitting with them through 11 painful sessions until the two men, who hadn't spoken in 3 years, finally embraced in her waiting room while Carol Jean quietly wept behind the front desk. She had guided the Whitfield couple through the darkest year of their marriage, after an affair nearly ended everything, until they came out the other side stronger than before, renewing their vows in a small backyard ceremony to which Winifred had been invited but hadn't attended, citing a scheduling conflict that didn't actually exist. She had sat with teenagers on the edge of despair and walked them gently back toward hope, memorizing the particular cadence of fear in a 15-year-old's voice, learning exactly when to speak and when to simply exist quietly in a room with someone who needed to not be alone. Her waiting room was always full. Her calendar was always booked 8 weeks out. Parents drove in from 3 counties over, because word had spread that Dr. Holloway had a gift, an almost uncanny ability to see exactly what a family needed before they could articulate it themselves. And every night, she went home to an empty craftsman house on the edge of town, made herself a small dinner she barely tasted, standing over the kitchen counter, and sat alone with a version of exhaustion so deep it had become invisible even to herself, the way a hum becomes silence once you've lived with it long enough. Winifred's ex-husband, Nathaniel Pierce, used to say she fixed everyone but herself, back when they were still married, back before he left her for a woman who, in his words, actually let herself be taken care of sometimes. At the time, Winifred had brushed it off as one more unfair criticism in a marriage full of them. One more thing Nathaniel didn't understand about the weight of her work, the responsibility of holding other people's pain. Looking back now, 4 years later, alone in a house to quiet for one person, she understood it as the one honest thing he had ever said to her. In 9 years of marriage, the unraveling, if it could even be called that, since it happened so quietly, nobody around her noticed at first, began on an ordinary Tuesday in late September. A new client walked into her office. A woman named Beatrice Okafor, 61 years old, recently widowed, sitting stiffly on the office's blue upholstered couch, twisting her wedding ring around her finger in a slow, absent motion. Beatrice spent the first 20 minutes of the session describing, in careful clinical detail, exactly how she had spent every single day since her husband's death, taking care of everyone else's grief, her children, her husband's siblings, even the neighbors who dropped by to reminisce over casseroles and old photographs, without once allowing herself the space to fall apart. "I don't even know what my own grief sounds like anymore," Beatrice said, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "I've been too busy managing everyone else's. My daughter cries, and I comfort her. My brother-in-law gets angry, and I calm him down. Everyone keeps telling me how strong I am, and I keep thinking, when does someone ask me what I need?" Winifred sat very still in her chair, pen frozen above her notepad. Something in the sentence landed with an unexpected, physical force, like a held breath, finally released after years of careful control. She managed to finish the session professionally, offering the careful, measured guidance she always offered, nodding at the right moments, reflecting Beatrice's feelings back to her with practiced warmth. But that night, driving home along the quiet, tree-lined roads of Cedar Hollow, past the old grain silo and the darkened windows of the hardware store, she found herself crying so hard she had to pull the car over onto the gravel shoulder near Route 9, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, finally hearing, for the first time in years, what her own exhaustion actually sounded like when it was allowed to speak. She didn't go to work the next day. She didn't go the day after that either. Her longtime receptionist, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Carol Jean Whitfield, who had worked alongside Winifred for 9 years and had seen thousands of families pass through that Victorian house, called her on the third day of unexplained absence, worried in the particular way that people worry about the ones who never ask for help. Winifred answered, finally, sitting on her kitchen floor in sweatpants she hadn't changed out of in 2 days, surrounded by an open mail and a coffee mug gone cold hours earlier, and admitted, for the first time out loud to another person, that she didn't think she could go back into that office and hold space for one more person's pain until she figured out where to put her own. Carol Jean didn't try to fix her. She didn't offer platitudes or reassurances. She simply said, "Took you long enough, honey," and drove over with a pot of vegetable soup and a loaf of bread, and sat with Winifred on the kitchen floor for 2 hours, without either of them saying very much at all. The following weeks were the strangest of Winifred's adult life. She canceled her appointments, a decision that terrified her more than almost anything she'd done since her divorce, because it meant, for the first time in her career, choosing herself over the needs of the people who depended on her. She rescheduled the Delgados. She referred 2 new intake calls to a colleague in the next town over, an act that felt, absurdly, like a small betrayal of everything she'd built her identity around. She spent her mornings sitting on her back porch, doing absolutely nothing, watching the fog lift off the field behind her house, which felt at first like failure, and eventually, slowly, began to feel like something closer to rest than she had experienced in half a decade. She started seeing her own therapist again, a gentle, sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Priscilla Yarrow, whom she hadn't visited since graduate school, because she had convinced herself, somewhere along the way, that being a therapist meant she was supposed to have already solved herself, that needing help herself would somehow disqualify her from being trusted to help others. You spent your whole career teaching people it's safe to fall apart, Dr. Yarrow told her during their second session together. Her office, smaller and plainer than Winifred's own, a single window looking out onto a parking lot. When are you going to believe that about yourself? Winifred didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. She sat with the question for days, turning it over during her long, empty mornings, feeling something old and calcified inside her chest begin, very slowly, to crack. It was during this strange, unmoored period of her life that she reconnected with Desmond Ferris, a widowed elementary school music teacher who lived 2 houses down and whom she had exchanged nothing more than polite waves with for the past 3 years. Desmond had lost his wife, Elena, to cancer 5 years earlier, and had spent those years raising his daughter, Josephine, alone, slowly rebuilding a quiet, steady kind of life around grief and small routines. Sunday pancakes, piano lessons after school, gardening on Saturday mornings, the kind of ordinary rituals that Winifred had noticed from a distance for years, without ever really seeing the man behind them. They started talking properly for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in October, when Winifred was sitting on her porch step, doing her strange new practice of nothing, still in her robe, though it was nearly noon, and Desmond walked over, holding 2 mismatched mugs of coffee, and simply sat down on the step beside her, without asking permission, the way old friends do, even when they aren't quite old friends yet. "You look tired," he said, handing her a mug. "Not the kind of tired sleep fixes." Winifred laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh, surprised out of her chest before she could stop it. "That obvious. I recognize it," Desmond said simply, settling beside her, his own coffee steaming in the cool autumn air. "I wore that same tired for about 2 years after Elena died. Everyone kept asking if I was okay, and I kept saying yes because saying no felt like too much to hand someone, like my grief was a bill nobody wanted to pay. Something about the plainness of his honesty made Winifred's chest loosen in a way that months of professional self-awareness hadn't managed to achieve. Over the following weeks, their conversations on that porch step became a quiet ritual. Not therapy, not romance yet, just two people who understood exhaustion, sitting beside each other without trying to solve it. Desmond never once asked her to fix anything for him. He never treated her expertise as a resource to be mined, the way so many people in her life unconsciously had for years, cornering her at parties with questions about their marriages, their children, their own private unraveling, assuming her professional warmth extended infinitely, free of charge, into every room she entered. Desmond simply asked how she was doing and waited patiently for a real answer, even when the real answer took her a long, halting minute to find. Winifred returned to work in November, but differently. She restructured her schedule to include actual 15-minute breaks between sessions, something she had recommended to dozens of overworked clients over the years without ever applying it to herself. She stopped taking calls after 7 in the evening, even when a familiar name flashed across her phone screen with the old, practiced urgency. She started, tentatively, allowing Carol Jean to see her cry, occasionally in the little kitchenette behind the office, and discovered that the world did not end when she let someone witness her struggling. That Carol Jean, if anything, seemed to trust her more for it, not less. She continued seeing Dr. Yarrow weekly, doing for herself the slow, unglamorous work of unlearning a lifetime of believing her own needs were an inconvenience to everyone around her. Some sessions were breakthroughs. Most were simply small, incremental shifts, learning to say, "I can't today," without a 3-paragraph apology attached, learning to sit with her own sadness for 5 minutes before immediately redirecting it towards someone else's comfort. Winifred returned to work in November, but differently. She restructured her schedule to include actual 15-minute breaks between sessions, something she had recommended to dozens of overworked clients over the years without ever applying it to herself. She stopped taking calls after 7 in the evening, even when a familiar name flashed across her phone screen with the old, practiced urgency. She started, tentatively, allowing Carol Jean to see her cry, occasionally in the little kitchenette behind the office, and discovered that the world did not end when she let someone witness her struggling. That Carol Jean, if anything, seemed to trust her more for it, not less. She continued seeing Dr. Yarrow weekly, doing for herself the slow, unglamorous work of unlearning a lifetime of believing her own needs were an inconvenience to everyone around her. Some sessions were breakthroughs. Most were simply small, incremental shifts, learning to say, "I can't today," without a 3-paragraph apology attached, learning to sit with her own sadness for 5 minutes before immediately redirecting it towards someone else's comfort. Winifred used to believe that being needed by everyone was the same thing as being whole, that her worth lived entirely in her usefulness to other people's pain, and that her own needs were simply a luxury she couldn't afford to indulge. It had taken a widow on a blue couch, a receptionist with a pot of soup, a therapist who asked the right question at the right time, and a quiet man, 2 houses down, who never once asked her to be anything other than exactly as tired as she actually was, to teach her something she had spent her entire career teaching others, that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and that allowing yourself to be filled is not selfishness, it is survival. She locked the office door behind her that evening, walked out into the cool autumn air, and drove home, not to an empty house, but to one where a light was already on, where dinner was already being made by someone else's hands, where for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not the only person in the room capable of holding things together, and that, she had come to understand, was not a failure of her strength. It was, finally, the whole point of it.